returning to the Babar Bar stage for the third time. Please, can you put your hands together for the wonderful Nick Denman?
Good evening. Tonight, I'm inviting you to accompany me as I relive an extraordinary school trip I went on a mere 38 years ago. So we went a long way north. I reckon probably further north than any school trip has ever been, but I did meet a man in the interval, in the loose, who told me that he used to run school trips and organise them, so I'm a little bit concerned saying that, but we'll find out. So we went to Svalbard. And I think the best way to show you how far north this is a map that's centred on the North Pole, because ordinary map projections rather distort the polar regions. As you can see, Svalbard is a long way north. It's further north than anything in Russia, mainland, Siberia, Alaska, Canada. In fact, the only land further north are a couple of uninhabited islands north of Russia, some of the permanent ice sheets at the north of Greenland, and a little bit of Ellesmere Island there north of Canada. So Svalbard is a set of islands halfway roughly between Norway and the North Pole, and Spitsbergen is the biggest island. That's where we went. In fact, we went up to the northern tip there. That's Raud Fjord, that one, and that's where we spent 5 weeks in the summer 38 years ago. So we flew into Tromsø and then caught another plane from Tromsø onto Longyearbyen, the main settlement, well, virtually the only settlement on Spitsberg. And the first night, we had to camp next to the airfield. That's the airfield just above. And the following day, we chartered this boat that took us 100 miles or so up the west coast to the northwestern tip of Spitsbergen. I'll briefly introduce you to some of my colleagues. This is Kevin. He was a geography teacher, intrepid traveller, great laugh, mad as a hatter. Chris was a chemistry teacher, so we put him in charge of first aid. Robin was a classics teacher. He led the expedition, and he was also in charge of the school's CCF, the Combined Cadet Force, so he had a lot of contacts in the army, which was very useful for reasons I shall explain. And finally, oh dear. Sorry, that's me as a young math teacher in the days when I used to have lots of hair. Moving on swiftly. So that is the assembled crew once we arrived. 4 teachers, 14 teenagers, 5 weeks in the Arctic. Not your average school trip. So set up some tents at base camp, and more importantly, the stores tent, because we had to take everything that 18 people would need to survive for 5 weeks in the high Arctic. There was no way we could get back to civilization at all until the boat came to get us 5 weeks later. So we took quite a lot of stuff with us. Now, I don't want you to think we didn't take health and safety seriously in those days. We did. We just didn't bother with all the paperwork. So we, in order to persuade the students, or perhaps more importantly their parents, to send them on this trip, we had to convince them that we were going to look after them and that we were likely to return safely. So we identified 2 main potential risks. So the first was what would happen if anybody got seriously ill or injured when we were up there, because we were a long way from anywhere else. So what we did was we said, right, well, fine, we will borrow some radio equipment from the army, train up a few of the kids how to use it, and if anyone did get into trouble, we would hopefully make radio contact with the governor of Spitsbergen, who had his office in Longyearbyen, and with any luck, they would send a helicopter to airlift anybody out if it was necessary. So this is the radio mast we erected at base camp. Actually, that photo I took, I think it was about a week into the trip. We had a 2-day snowstorm that confined us to our tents for 48 hours, really couldn't do anything. And after that, it all looked a bit different. So it turned out that radio contact wasn't as easy as we thought it might be. But most weeks we did manage to get through to the governor's office in Longyearbyen and let him know that we were all okay. So that was lucky. There was one other major potential danger we identified, which was these things. So Svalbard has a very large population of polar bears. And these beautiful animals are serious killing machines. So I weigh about 80 kilograms. An average male adult polar bear weighs about 800 kilograms. They have 4-inch claws on their huge paws and very sharp teeth. They are beasts. I suppose if you can get through the thick blubber of a seal, then a human's not going to cause much problem to you. So we did our research and checked out, and good news, turned out that polar bear attacks on humans were pretty rare. Bad news, just the year before, 2 scientists were camping a couple of miles from where we planned to be, and sure enough, one of them got eaten by a polar bear. The other one lived to tell the tale. But they were there in early May, when there was lots of sea ice around, the field was full of sea ice, therefore lots of seals, therefore lots of polar bears. And we were assured that when we went in July, sea ice would have retreated, and the polar bears, most of them, would have headed over to the eastern end of Svalbard, where there was likely to be more food for them. So we were told that the probability of us encountering a polar bear was unlikely. But if we did encounter one, they would probably be lost, very hungry, and very dangerous. Okay, so what do we do? Well, good old army. We borrowed some rifles from the army, and 4 teachers and 14 teenagers went off to an army rifle range for the day to learn how to shoot. And everywhere we went, every group had to have at least 2 rifles with them. I dread to think what paperwork you would have to complete these days to be allowed to issue rifles and live ammunition to teenagers on a school trip. Different times, different times. We did lots of training. That's me learning how to climb an ice wall with my crampons and ice axes. But my main responsibility on the trip was to be in charge of the inflatable, because I like boats. So we borrowed some dry suits from the army, thank you. Checked to see if they worked. Yep, they did. So to set off and explore the field and a bit further afield. Some days there was bits of ice floating around in the field, and we did see seals, but every time we tried to get close enough to take a photo, they would disappear under the water. So it's frustrating. But I was quite keen to go to the head of the field and have a look at the glacier up close, which was fantastic, actually. It was lovely. Although a couple of days later, we were all standing at base camp and heard this enormous clap of thunder. Blue sky, hang on, that can't be thunder. And then we realized that a large chunk of ice, the size of an average block of flats, I would say, had carved off from the end of the glacier and fallen into the field with a huge splash. I never went quite that close again in the inflatable. The students were all very keen to get up on the glacier and have a look at that. And although they look beautiful and enchanting from a distance, up close, they're actually filthy and pretty dangerous. Full of mud and rocks and crevasses, which are very deep, most of which are covered by a thin layer of snow and ice, so you can't see them. But we did get them all onto the glacier and safely off again, I'm glad to say. So this was a particularly memorable few days. I think it was a 3-day trip. I took, 4 of the teenagers off to go and climb some mountains and then see if we could explore the neighboring valleys and fjords. Turned out to be quite a steep climb, that one. Yeah, steeper than I was thinking it might be, but we did all get to the top. Although you've got to be quite careful with these snow-covered peaks because you never quite know how far the snow and ice on the cornice sort of leant over the top and exactly where the rock underneath is and where it stops and it's just snow and ice leaning over. But I was quite keen to have a look into the next valley, so I managed to take that photo, looking down. Not sure I should have got that close to the edge, actually. But different times. Coming down was a lot more fun and much quicker. It's funny, it didn't look very steep, that. I can assure you it was. And then the following day we climbed some more mountains and the sun came out. Why do we climb mountains? I'm not sure really, but I like it. And the views are amazing. So yes, sun came out. Some days you could even hike in t-shirts, despite it being about 80 degrees latitude north. It was a good day for photos, that one. Although with all the snow and ice, and I didn't have a terrific camera, to be honest. I think it was, what was it called in those? I think it was a compact camera, a Canon Sure Shot or something. Does that ring any bells? But they didn't come out too bad, although most of them ended up looking a bit like silhouettes. But some fun photos. More silhouettes. We often had to cross mountain streams, which were freezing. I'm not a scientist, I don't know quite how this works, but the water in the streams was actually below at -2. I don't quite understand how that works. It can be moving, but -2. Anyway, apparently it was. But if you were lucky, you found some stepping stones to keep your feet dry, because you certainly didn't want them to get wet, although sometimes they did. Now that was a very long hike, and the lads got very tired that day, as did the teachers. But there was normally enough driftwood around on the shoreline to build a campfire and revive everyone with a hot drink at the end of a long day. Yeah, I am disappointed I didn't get more photos of wildlife. Most of these are photos I took. I have to explain, the polar bear one, I pinched from the internet. It was taken on Spitsbergen, but not by me. So those are Arctic terns. I don't know if you can sort of see them flying around up here. You might have noticed a distinct lack of trees in the Arctic. So where do they build their nests? Well, on the shore. And you can't see where they are. And if you unwittingly get too close, then the Arctic terns would come and attack you. Quite seriously, to be honest, with their claws on your head. So you had to carry around a stick if you were around this area. I don't know if you can see, kid's got a big stick there waving around his head to protect himself from the Arctic terns. We saw Arctic foxes. They weren't as beautiful as I was expecting. They're beautifully white in winter when it's snow, and in summer, when the ground looks like that, they're grey and black and not so attractive. And again, really hard to spot and never got close enough for a decent photo. Not with my camera anyway, I'm afraid. We also came across some deserted old hunters' lodges from around the turn of the century, about 1900s apparently, which they used to use when they were allowed to go hunting in those days. They used to go in the spring and the autumn, basically, and hunt polar bears, seals, and reindeer. And I assume most of the times they succeeded, but of course, sometimes they didn't. One of the things up there is that you can't dig more than about a foot into the ground before you hit the solid permafrost. So I suppose they just had to dig a shallow grave and pile some stones on the top. I reckon the polar bear won that one. Another interesting feature of permafrost, which I never knew about, is these sort of stone circles or polygons sometimes. So the successive thawing in the summer and freezing in the winter, the permafrost somehow pushes all the large stones to the outside and leaves gravel in the middle. And there were areas where there were just loads of these. There's sort of another one there, another one up there, up there. So littered with these strange, you'd swear they were man-made, but they're not. They're just a weird feature of permafrost. So one day in the middle of August, we were at base camp and a helicopter arrived. And it turned out that the governor had sent a couple of his inspectors out to visit us to check that we were following the regulations for camping in the wild in Spitsbergen. And they delivered some very interesting news to the students. Who can guess what news students were keen to receive in the middle of August? Yes, I reckon I think 5 of the team were upper 6 students, and I reckon they're probably the only A-level students ever to receive their results by helicopter. Extraordinary. And luckily, most of them have done well enough. About a week before the end of the trip, I took this photograph from top of another mountain, looking out towards the North Pole. Now, the sea ice was supposed to be at least 30 miles away in the summer, but it's about 1.5 miles there. You can sort of see the sea ice, pack ice, stretching all the way to the North Pole, and that was only just over 1 mile away from the shore. And we got a little bit worried about that, because if the sea ice was going to come back early, it wasn't supposed to come back until way into late September. But then the boat wouldn't be able to come and get us. But luckily, the wind changed direction, and the sea ice never got any closer. So I'll finish with just a few of my favorite slides from the top. It was just beautiful up there. I'm not sure my poor photographs do it justice, but here they are. Just some of my favorite pictures. It's a bit like the top 1,000 meters of the Alps, but without the 2,000 meter climb to get there. And a couple that I pinched from Kevin, who had a much better camera than me and had filters and things like that. Oh yes, so on the way back, the boat, on the trip back down south, we stopped off at a place called Ny Alesund, which, I'm checking just the other day, is still the most northerly permanently inhabited place on Earth. In the winter, there's at least 6 people who live there, apparently. In the summer, it goes up to about 20. Busy place. It actually has a tiny post office, would you believe? So the students all headed off to send a postcard home, although I reckon they got back before it. And I wandered off to chat to the bloke tying up his yacht there. I wondered if he might speak English. Turned out he was Norwegian. So, of course, he spoke perfect English. And we chatted, and he invited me into his cabin, have a cup of coffee and meet his wife, who told me he was English. Turned out to be a girl I'd been at school with 10 years previously. Even in the Arctic wilderness, it can appear to be a small world sometimes. And I took that final photograph when we got back to Longyearbyen. We'd come 100 miles south, a bit further away from the North Pole, and I took that photo just after midnight, because after 5 weeks of continuous daylight. That was the lowest the sun had ever got. And I thought, oh, is it going to disappear completely? But no, it threatened to become a sunset, decided it was a sunrise instead, and came back up again. Now, as we know, we're used to the sun setting in the west and rising in the east. So what direction was I facing when it was both a sunrise and a sunset? Yeah, due north, correct, well done. Weird, but wonderful. Well, I had a fantastic time. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Excellent. Nick Denman, everybody.